the Windward Community College Common Book event, and Nancy for having us here at this wonderful facility. Really, thank you for being here. This is it's not an easy thing for me to talk about. Talking about my friend Percy, who sold me that wonderful car that got me through graduate school. We bought the car right up the road here in Waikane Valley. And at that time, we drove in through the jungle and came upon this house. And the first thing Percy said was, "Let me go get my motto." And he invited his mom outside, and his mom was introduced to us. Then we later bought the car that was sitting in the yard, and it was like going back in time for us. It was just a really magical place that it's hard to find places like that anymore. Percy was born in 1973 and grew up in Waikane Valley. He graduated from Castle High School in 1991. Probably would have gone here if he continued on to college. Instead of that, he flew all the way up to Japan and became an extremely successful sumo wrestler. He was up there for 7 years, came back in 1998, and 7 years later, he was stabbed to death about 2 miles from here. And at the funeral over in Hawaiian Memorial, you know how you go to a funeral and there's a little reception line, and you get there at like 11, you go through the line, and maybe at about 12 o'clock the service begins. The service didn't begin until about 4:30 because there were that many people, 1,000 people would come. And right in the middle of this, I come upon Percy's mom, whom I hadn't seen in 4 years, and whom I'd only met for that brief moment when we came to buy the car. And she said, "You wrote this book. You're the guy who wrote the book. You're the writer. Somebody should have written a book about Percy, but now it's too late." And I thought, well, I don't think so. Let's see what we can do about this. And a few months later, we went back and discussed it. "You really want to do this?" She said, "Yeah, let's do this." And so what we have and what we wound up with is my attempt to try to figure out how the hell that could have happened. That a guy who's got over 1,000 people coming to his funeral can wind up getting killed in a wonderful place like this. I'm going to start by reading from the first page and go from there. Here's how it happened. Percy Kipapa of Waikane lay face down on the ground, desperately sucking for air. His mouth opened wide, dry all the way to the back of his throat. His huge upper body heaved up and down. His mind raced as he prayed that whatever it was they were hitting him with would stop sending its stinging jolts of pain across the bare skin of his back. He tried to open his eyes, but with his already blurred vision now clouded by a well of tears, he could make out nothing, only the feeling that they were all surrounding him. When the burn of the sand and salt they had shoved into his face became too much, he shut his eyes tight, feeling their presence, more than 20 of them, shouting and taunting as the stick came down yet again. The sting that arose was so sharp it must have drawn blood, but he couldn't tell for sure, the rest of his body burning with muscle fatigue so deep that even his feeble gasps for air hurt. His back, the backs of his legs, and his massive shoulders were on fire, his arms now rubbery with exhaustion. The voices kept shouting from all directions, coming closer. All he knew for sure was that he had to get up off the ground somehow, if only he could suck in enough air, if only his arms would move. And then the kicking started. As if it wasn't already struggle enough to get some oxygen into his lungs, the biggest guy there was now kicking him in the ribs. He'd wanted it to end long before they'd even thrown him down, but no, it had gone from pushing to slaps to the head to getting thrown to the rock-hard ground to beatings with a stick, and now with each thud to his side, he'd begun to give up on the chance of it ever ending. He tried to open his eyes again, and through the blur he could make out the shape of a man, bigger than his brother Kurt, stepping forward like a massive 500-pound field goal kicker with one leg pulled back. And then Percy's side exploded in pain, the kick pushing all the air from his greedy lungs again. And he wondered for a moment if this might feel what it feels like to drown. 20 guys mobbing him, and he was going to die from lack of oxygen. Another whack, and this time the pain went deeper, not a sting, but a body punch that lit up every muscle in his back. The shouts around him grew louder, and when he opened his eyes, even through the blur, even on the edge of passing out, he could see that what they were now hitting him with was an aluminum baseball bat. The big man held it high over his head with both hands for one still moment before bringing it down again hard, and it occurred to Percy that he might actually die, that all of them had gotten so caught up in the moment they could no longer see how far they were taking this, that he would never see his mother's face again, that they would send his body home to her in a box, and what in the world would they tell her? That he couldn't get up off the ground? And suddenly he began to feel the slightest drips of energy seep into his exhausted arms. If not for the fact that every ounce of his own body was now focused on the task of lifting himself from his hands to his knees, he would have seen that what was now energizing him was the purest form of fear he'd ever felt. Heaving loudly now, pushing the air and then sucking in with all he had, he pushed on the floor with his big hands and rose. This first little surprising show of progress energizing him further, until he managed to bring one leg under himself and then the other, opening his eyes to the sting of tears in search of something to hang on to. Finding nothing but the round shapes of the men standing over him, he stood at last and reached out for a shoulder to steady himself. The shouts rang out again, now with more urgency, and Percy's thoughts exploded from someone's roundhouse open hand at the side of his head, and a voice was telling him, "The water, brah, go get the water." For a moment he stood in confusion. The water. Another open hand shook him. He followed his instincts through the surrounding bodies and over to the corner of the area, wiping his eyes so that he could just make out the tiny faucet and a long bamboo ladle leaning next to it. He managed to fill the ladle and then fought against his heaving body to steady it and carried it over to the big man with the baseball bat, with enough water spilling from its side so that when he reached it was only half full. Bowing his head, he offered the water and through heavy breaths said, "Mashta." When the big man sipped from the ladle and spat out onto the ground, Percy found it hard to believe that he was free, that it was over. Still a bit unsure if it had all really happened, he stood against the wall and waited. The sound of his greedy gulps for air filled the room, even over the slap and swish of the next boy charging the big Hawaiian, who then slid him back across the sand-covered ring, even above the grunts and shouts of encouragement from the other boys who only moments earlier seemed about to converge for the kill. As Percy waited for his labored breathing to show some sign of slowing down, he wondered what on earth was it they had just put him through. And as if to answer his thoughts, a voice cut through the loud huffing sound, a knowing voice that had once been through the same thing, a local voice. "That's what you call kawaii-gari." Kawaii-gari. Still gulping for air, Percy turned to see the figure of Troy Talaimatai, his senpai, his senior, whose hair was tied into a samurai topknot that bent over his forehead into a black point. A Samoan from Hawaii, Troy looked nearly twice the size of the biggest lineman on a Hawaii high school football field. But even standing there almost naked, dressed in nothing but a length of canvas that covered his balls and the crack of his ass and wound around his waist into a thick black belt, if he were to jump up and down, not an ounce of his rock-hard body would jiggle. Kawaii-gari means tender loving care. Tender loving care. This book contains an account of how Percy might have actually been killed, and that's not it. That was an account of what amounts to something that's almost a daily occurrence in practice if you intend to be a professional sumo wrestler. And the fact that a kid from Waikane finds himself in that ring in the middle of Tokyo in November, freezing, not knowing a word of Japanese, raises a number of questions. And we'll get to some of those. The first thing is, however, that there's a purpose for that beating that these guys put each other through. Sometimes it's kind of a hazing ritual. Sometimes it's done for discipline if somebody steals something or does something wrong. But mainly, it is meant to teach an important Japanese cultural value called gaman. And it's a hard word to translate, but it's kind of how you might explain how a Japanese salaryman would put up with a 40-year, nearly vacationless career that includes 4 hours of getting stuff done to a train every morning and evening. It's how you endure without complaint in the face of tremendous odds. And this kawai-gari thing is supposed to teach you how to do that. What these guys in Japan did not know is that Percy knew all about gaman. And the reason he knew all about gaman is because he's from here. And by here, I mean the windward side. And more specifically, he's from Waikane, Waiole Waikane. And Percy knew about gaman because he learned about it from the stories of his grandfather, Manuel Roberts. I don't know if you folks know, but 2,000 acres of Waikane Valley used to be Kuleana land. And Percy's family were original owners of a hui, of part of a hui, of a share of Kuleana land in Waikane Valley. There were, in fact, 35 shares or 35 families who bought this hui in 1852. And there was a Holly guy by the name of Lincoln McCandless who from the early 1900s up until 1942 began picking off those shares one by one until he owned all except two. And the reason Mr. McCandless, although he already owned 35,000 acres statewide, wanted this land is because he wanted to take the water from this side and move it to the other side to irrigate for sugar. Okay? From 1942 until 1970, Percy's grandfather, Manuel Roberts, fought against this guy in land court and won. If you talk to Percy's uncle, Henry Roberts, he'll say, my father was the only guy who fought against the Howley under their law and won. Percy's grandfather cultivated 59 acres up in Waikane Valley. He had 7 kids, and they all worked that land, and they all fed themselves, and they sold the extra stuff they didn't need to eat down in Alawana and made money and survived. Now we hear all about subsistence farming, we talk about sustainable ag, we talk about how to protect ag lands and feed ourselves. We hear about this all now. This is what these guys are doing all the way through the 60s and 70s. Then in 1974, a guy named Joe Powell was a developer. He developed Enchanted Lakes, he developed a bunch of other subdivisions all over the place. He had plans to turn all of Waiole Waikane into what Kainiki looks like now. That was supposed to be all suburban housing for people who are not from here. Anybody hear about, what's the thing called, Envision Laie? You know what that is? They want to turn, I don't know, at least 1,000, maybe more acres of sugar land up in Kahuku into 1,200 homes for people who are not from here. And use the term affordable housing. If you can afford a $600,000 home, there you go. In 1974, the regular folks, Percy's Uncle Arnold, Percy's Uncle Henry, and a guy named Bob Nakata, who's from Kahalu, and some other folks, Bobby Fernandez, other people from this area, they formed the Waiole Waikane Association, and they stopped it from happening. You don't see any homes in Waiole Waikane. They persuaded George Ariyoshi to buy hundreds of acres of that and preserve it. This is what Percy was born into. This is Gaman. These people were putting their lives on the line to save the land. There were plans in place by the state to take the people who were protesting their evictions from this land and protesting this development. There were plans in place to have CPS take the kids away. This was for real. This wasn't just some Facebook page or some sign wave. And they won. Unbelievable. This is what Percy was born into. He didn't need to learn about Gaman. Now, after having heard in kind of graphic detail the sort of stuff he had to go through when he went to Japan, you might be wondering, why would he have left in the first place? Look, this is a beautiful spot. He came from one of the tightest, most loving, incredible families you will ever find. In this beautiful place. Okay? At least two reasons why he would have left here. The first of them has to do with all of the dreams of fame and fortune that any of us have. When Percy went up to Japan in 1991, there were already 13 other local guys who had gone up to Japan, and several of whom started to make money and become famous. I don't know if you ever heard of guys like Akebono and Konishiki and Takamiyama and people like that. Okay, just briefly, this is how it works. There's over 800 people who belong to the Japan Professional Sumo Association. When you join all the way at the bottom of 6 divisions. Every 2 months, there's a tournament, and if you win more bouts than you lose in the tournament, you rise up the ranks. Now, when you get from the 4th rank to the 5th rank, your life changes dramatically. All the guys down at the bottom, they're the first guys to get up in the morning, they're the last guys to eat, and if there's one of the top rankers that they're living in the same stable with who needs his back scrubbed in the shower or other assistance, it's your job to do that. You're a slave. Okay? The most successful point of any sumo wrestler's career is when he is promoted out of the slave ranks and into the paid ranks. Once you are promoted into these paid ranks, not only do you get a monthly salary of lots of money, okay, but you also fall under the Japanese patronage system. And that means there's rich guys that own big companies that want to entertain their guests, and they will invite you along as part of the entertainment because you're a famous sumo wrestler. And at the end of the night, you know what they give you? They give you a big fat envelope full of 10,000 yen notes, 500, 1,000 bucks. And over the course of a year, you can make a lot of money. Okay, so that's one reason why he might have gone up to Japan and left this incredible place. He's going to make it. There's another reason too. He was running away from here. In 1974, coordinated with federal and state law enforcement, a marijuana eradication campaign began on the Big Island called Operation Green Harvest. In 1990, when Percy was a junior in high school, the National Institute of Drug Abuse conducted a survey study and concluded that here in Hawaii, in 1990, here in Hawaii, 90% of people who smoked ice, who used ice, smoked ice. 86% of people who were addicted to ice had started it after 1985. All right? Now, in 1987, 3 things happened kind of at the same time. Number 1, Green Harvest peaked in its efficiency by pulling 2 million plants statewide. That saw the cost of an ounce of Papalolo rise from about $24 to close to $1,400. Number 2, the 500 acres that used to belong to Percy's grandfather were bought by a Japanese man named Kitaro Watanabe to build a golf course. Okay, maybe they beat the guys who wanted to build suburban development in Waikane. Guess what? The fight kept on happening. Guess what? It's still happening. Number 3, 1987, Percy entered high school. Okay? This is 1987. This is many, many years before anybody knew that just trying ice once gave you a 15% chance of getting hooked for life. This is before you saw those, what are those things? The posters with people with scabs on them. Hawaii Meth Project. Hey, that was, what? That was 20 years away. Nobody knew what this thing was. So Percy tried ice. And when the invitation came to run away from here, he did like he had a psychology degree. You know what psychologists tell you if you're an addict? They say remove yourself from the peer group. That's what he did. He went up to Japan and he quit. Okay, they'll also tell you something about choices. And this is where, you know, why does this book exist? I wanted to find out how the hell that could have happened to him, right? Raised in a perfect family, loving family, wonderful place like this. First, he did drugs. Wow. People who deal with addiction will put me on the list of reasons why Percy's dead. They'll put anybody on the list of reasons why Percy's dead who has used the word choice in the same sentence with addiction. Okay? Nobody chooses to have all their teeth come out. Nobody chooses to refinance the house, pay for their habit. It's not a choice. That's how addiction works. Okay. Now, where did we leave Percy? He ran away from here. He made it up to Japan. He got away from this monster that he saw encroaching upon him. And now he's trying to make it up to the paid ranks in sumo. This is a quote from the same guy that appeared in the beginning, Troy Talaimatai, the big Samoan guy. After 3 years of Percy, 4 years of Percy persevering in tender loving care, eating, and trying to make it, learn the sport. Here's what Troy says. I used to just blow him off the charge, boom. Then when Percy found out, this is how you stop Troy, whoo. One time I just came up, boom, he grabbed me. So I tried to snap his hand off my belt. Then I could hear him growling. That growl came. Then he came with his other hand. Boom, I'm stuck. So I'm going to try to switch to my left hand, try to get my lock in. And get my left hand in. Okay, I figure I get Percy right here. I move. No moving. So here's Percy in what turns out to be the most competitive area in your career as a sumo wrestler. It's not when you get to the top and you're fighting for the championship. It's when you're right in the middle here, and if you lose, you go home and scrub somebody in the shower, and if you win, you get lots of money. These guys fight. You go to sumo, don't go to watch the top guys. Go to watch these guys. They're scrapping for their lives. This is how Percy handled that in the Nagoya tournament in 1995. The last match I had, he said, the last match I had that tournament was with this big bastard, Kanisaku, this guy who later reached the top division. He came straight for me and I forearmed him in his face and slapped the shit out of him. I was like, yeah. And on the eve of his 22nd birthday, Percy found himself standing alone with a perfect 7-0 record. Not even Akebono had ever done that. At the time, he recounted the tournament much more humbly in a telephone interview to Ferg Lewis from The Advertiser. I was just trying to get some more wins, one at a time, and the next thing I knew, I was going for number 7. He changed a lot in the past year, is what his boss said at the time. He's gotten stronger and tougher. He's got more fighting spirit. To tell you the truth, a year ago I didn't know if he could make it, but he's really come on. This perfect record was rewarded with a $25,000 cash prize, and even better, Daiki, which was his sumo name, which translates into big happiness. Daiki, Percy Kipapa, would become only the 14th non-Japanese in a long history, hundreds of years of history of sumo, to be promoted into its upper divisions. One of the strong and tenacious 5% of anyone who ever even tries sumo to at last reach the paid ranks. Percy had his own ways, Troy said. Even though boss wanted Percy for push, and he would in the beginning, he would always end up grabbing. But then once Percy knew how to bend his knees and get down low, there was no way he was going to move that mountain of Waikane. The next chapter starts 10 years later with a quote from Percy's dad. May 16th, 2005. While my wife and I were watching TV, our son Kurt with his ohana and akebono stopped by to inform us Percy was killed tonight and asked us to stay away from the crime scene on Okana Road in Kahalu. We watched the TV news to get more information. So, Robert, in fact, called me up. He's telling me I'm sorry to hear about your friend. You know, the one from your book, the guy in your book. He was stabbed. I said, who, Troy? Tyler? No. Who? Why do I keep saying who? Not going to be Percy. Person. And the funeral thing, you know how it goes, 2-3 days of crying and laughing and telling stories. And all it was 31 years old, this guy. Could speak perfect Japanese. He'd been back from Japan for 7 years. He knew all this stuff from sumo. Couldn't this guy get a job? You know, what happened? How did it come to this? How did he get back on the stuff? He weighed 480 pounds. Well, here's how. Remember those big thick envelopes you get? All the stuff full of money? Percy's friend Tyler got him a job at the airport. You know, ever been to the Japanese arrivals area? And it's all, 7 to about 11 in the morning. There's hundreds of them pouring off the plane like this big waterfall of money. And so Percy got one of those jobs where you go greet them and you check off their name and you bring them to the right bus and all that. You can imagine he's big happiness. That's why they gave him that name. He's a big, lovable guy. Perfect Japanese coming out. They're laughing and loving. The boss goes, hey, you go stand on the side and you just take pictures with all these guys. They want to take a picture with you. Okay, this is all right. And Percy thought it was like, because they still recognized him as a famous sumo wrestler. It might have been because they never saw a real live Hawaiian before, especially someplace near the airport. You can touch him, he's here. It's a Hawaiian. Wow. In Hawaii, actually in Hawaiians in Hawaii. Here's one. Take a picture. End of the day, the boss gave him an envelope. All right. Hey, this is just like Japan. The Japanese boss gave me the envelope. I could do this. I know I'm just a $10 whore at the airport, but if they give me one of these envelopes, all right. So I opened up the envelope. $5.
7 years, learn all what you did, bring back that perspective. And that's what you did. I thought you was going to be like Akimono. Come you never meet Yokozuna. So that stuff happened. Another thing happened here. Remember the stuff about how the community got together and protested and won and stopped the development from happening? This happened here. Percy was killed here. Can you believe that? This is the most activist community in the entire state. This whole place is like it's on Neighborhood Watch. You're not going to find a more engaged community than between here and like Ka'ava. You're not going to find it. How'd that happen here? Well, one of the things this activist community did in 2003, 2 years before Percy was killed, was they said enough. We had enough. We got to do something about this drug problem. And they started waving signs, and they ignited this awareness campaign that spread statewide. There are 250 people down at Key Project for a meeting. Put aside their busy 3 jobs life, come to this meeting, let's do something. They did. The question is, why did it have to start at the bottom? Why didn't we get the leadership from the top? Well, anyway, it did start at the bottom. And the top listened. I don't care how cynical you are about how government works and about what all the crooks are doing down in the legislature or whatever you might think. But in response to that 2003 awareness campaign, the legislature came through. They went and visited all these treatment centers statewide. They did research. They had a stack of peer-reviewed research this high. They didn't just make it up. And then they put together legislation for a treatment plan worth $14 million. $14 million, almost all of it going to drug treatment. Because if you lock up a drug dealer, what'd you just do? You created a job opening. You got to put the investment in the treatment because it works. Go right down the hill. Go to Hina Mountain. That place makes miracles happen. It works. Okay? This bill for the legislation for the $14 million treatment plan landed on the desk of former governor and current senatorial candidate Linda Lingle, and she vetoed it. The legislature overrode her veto. And she refused to sign the bill into law. Then she refused to release the funding. And the funding was finally released many months later after this activist community created the political pressure that could not be ignored. The former CEO of Hina Malka right down the hill, a guy named Andy Anderson, himself a recovering alcoholic for over 40 years. I asked him about that. I said, Andy, they had this thing and they were ready to go with it, and then months go by without releasing this money. How many people did you have to turn away who came to Hina Malka for help because you didn't have that funding? And Andy's a big guy. He's a big, tough guy. He started crying. He couldn't answer the question. He sees these people in his lobby already asking for help. They finally took the step, asked for help. Help wasn't there. Eventually the money was released and it was treated like a one-shot deal. That was it. That's why this problem persists today. Now, as Robert said, I found myself locked in vaults downtown and looking at, doing research and driving up and down the Middle Coast. Lucky enough, there was a fare war going on, so it only cost me $20 to fly back and forth at that time. But started to get mad when you start going, wait a minute, this was 2 years before Percy was killed. When you go, in 1990, they were warning you about ICE. Starting to get mad. Hey, and then I ran into Bob Nakata, and
He's now a pastor of the Methodist Church in Kabaloo. He's like the guy behind a lot of this activism. He's behind the scenes. And he and I were speculating about, you know what, maybe some people didn't want to solve the problem, because it's pretty good when, you know, certain types of people get hooked on drugs and kill each other. Now, it's a little bit cynical and evil to push it in that direction too far, because then you start sounding like a conspiracy theorist. But you do have to wonder if a problem like this that is so fixable, and Hina Malka is your example, persists for over 25 years, who's benefited? So Bob said, you know what, there's this thing you ought to read. It's the socioeconomic impact statement for a highway 12 miles long that somebody wanted to build between Pearl Harbor and the Kaneohe Marine Base. So I found that thing. Ekpo, Dean, Austin, and Williams, these were the guys who were contracted by the state to do the socioeconomic impact statement for H3. They have a study area that they interviewed people in, and they traveled around, and they talked to interested community groups and so forth. The study area extends roughly from the area where Percy was killed up to the other end of Waikane Valley where he grew up. That's the study area. This is what that socioeconomic impact statement said, among other things. State and city public planning agencies have expressed concern for maintaining the element of choice in selection of homes and lifestyles. It would appear, however, with projected development in the study area, choice would merely become limited to a rather narrow range of price alternatives. The spatial imperatives of traditional lifestyles and subsistence patterns of communing with nature could not survive such an environment. Further, with encroaching residential development and related higher housing costs and land tax values, a portion of the study area residents would either be tempted or forced to abandon their traditional ways of life and employment and accept the historical and tragic trend of welfare or menial city jobs and the high-density urban squalor of public housing. That was written in 1973, the year that Percy Kipapa was born. Nobody listened. And Bob told me about this. He said, you know, those guys that did that statement, they were good. It was 1972 they were doing that. They were going out and interviewing everybody. And these guys, they'd done about 15, 16 different socioeconomic or EISs or other things for the state, and often did recommend for development to happen. But when Bob told me about this particular study for H3, he said, you know what? They never got another contract from the state again. And just one last thing so we don't walk out of here feeling hopeless. Percy did reach the paid ranks in sumo. He wound up having to retire because in sumo, if you become injured, there's no disabled list. Injury will force you to miss a tournament, and your absences are treated as losses, and you tumble all the way back down to the bottom. That's what happened to him. But one of the guys who he used to compete with when he was at that really competitive stage and did finally make it into the paid ranks was a guy named Chio Taikai. Chio Taikai managed to reach the second highest rank in sumo and in fact won 3 major tournaments. And a year after Percy was killed, I went up to see him in Japan. And he and I were talking about Percy, whom we hadn't seen in over 10 years. And he remembered everything about it. He was doing, you know, the dance that Percy does, and Percy wore glasses and he would always go like this. This Japanese guy is doing the perfect imitation of him. He's clearly a good friend of Percy's from his Japan days. And he told me, and I said, what was your record against Percy? And he said, my career record against Percy, against Ike, it was 5-2. I was the winner. Chio Taikai, he was one of the top sumo wrestlers of his era. You know, he was like Derek Jeter. 5-2. So I walked away from him going over in my head all I'd just heard from Chio Taikai, and he was in the lead a third of the way through that current tournament. Our record was 5-2, was what he'd said. I was the overall winner. He'd said it without a trace of arrogance. The smile that appeared on his face when he recounted his career record against Percy, whom he hadn't faced in nearly a decade. That tone. I was the winner. It was almost as though he'd surprised himself. Like the numbers should have read the opposite way. Like, of course, Percy should have been the one who come out on top. It came out like this. I did it. Ozeki Chio Taikai, 10 years later, with what he considered a great chance to win his 4th major tournament, was proud of himself. He was proud of himself because he'd been able to come away with a winning record against Percy. And he sounded a lot like all of those retired sumo tori had that day when Percy and I sat in the sumo arena. And all these guys just kept coming up to him, and saying, "Mottainai, mottainai." They wanted him to come back and compete again. Mottainai, spoken in pure admiration. Because they knew Percy. Because they missed him. And what they all knew better than any of us was that when you held up your hands to indicate that you had carried no weapons, it's that sumo gesture. When you held up your hands to indicate you carried no weapons, and when it was a game that hadn't been rigged since sometime long before he was born, Percy Kipapa could fight. That's it. If you're here for extra credit, you're dismissed. But if anybody would like to ask any questions or anything, I'd be happy to answer whatever questions you might have. Yeah. I spoke to Keith Ryder, was another guy who helped organize that stuff, the sign. He was in fact the real spark behind the sign way back in, it was 9 years ago now. Him and Andy Anderson, the guy from Kingdom Mountains, now retired, Bob Nakata, those 3 guys got that thing going. And it's really hard to reignite something like that, because they did this real incredible thing to get people aware. And then what they got from the very top was, no, we're not gonna help you. And that would lead people to kind of give up. And some of the things that resulted immediately were neighborhood watch things, Honolulu and stuff like that. But all 3 of those guys, Bob, Andy, and Keith, the final question is, so how are things now? And this was a couple of years ago when I did ask him that. Mm-hmm. Bob said, look at all these tremendous victories we have for anti-development. Okay, but he says, I think we failed on the social side. And then Keith will say, you know, we don't see chronics under the banyan tree anymore, and that's not even how they'll put it anymore. Because now people understand that nobody chooses to be that. Anybody who uses that terminology is part of the problem. Don't dismiss them as a chronic, go help them out, get them to rehab. Okay, but those guys will all say, we're about to start something, but now the only difference mainly is that people are a little bit more open and ready to talk about it, which is huge. Okay, but given what could have happened at the time, it's kind of disappointing. So, you know, what can you do now? First of all, stop judging people who have a drug addiction or an alcohol addiction. That was hard for me to do.
I remember sitting in the courtroom during the murder trial where it came out unequivocally that Percy was an addict. How was I before that? Nah, they must have made that up. Nah, I know his body tested positive, but they must have done something, dirtied it up, or they just were in denial about this. You gotta be able to say, you know what, he's an addict. Guess what? I don't have any hair on my head. I'm genetically predisposed to not have hair on my head. Some other people are genetically predisposed to addiction. That's what happens. Once you do that and stop judging the addict, all of us, collectively as a society, then they can be helped, this can be fixed.
I remember, it's kind of old, but I remember all that stuff happening. There were many big colors guys from West White Panek. I was there at a confrontation with the police and everything was there. And this one guy from White told them, you guys willing to die for your job, but I wouldn't to die for this land. I was like, whoa. What
Those guys closed off the highway, right?
Yeah, closed the highway. Right there, the guy told me, wouldn't to die for your job, but I wouldn't to die for this land. And it was like, serious shit.
This was not like some fashionable, picket signs thing. This was real life. And they did it. They won.
Mark, one of the most remarkable things about them, many remarkable things about Japan, your ability to get access to people at all levels throughout this. Did you hit dead ends? Were you rebuffed in trying to get answers to these questions? And if so, did you just say, okay, that door is not going to open? Did you go around the side door? How did you deal with that? How did you get the access that you got? Your loving personality.
Well, my wife lives up there too, so it was. I was up there anyway. But in both of these books, what kind of surprised me the most of it was that you just kind of ask people. And then when you sit down and ask people, we don't normally have conversations where we're very interested in what the other person says. And when you're the guy who's very interested in what the other person says, they will go. They'll go. Because unfortunately, we all like to go, you just said Seattle? Oh yeah, I went to Seattle once, and I did this. Let's talk about how I did there. Really? And if it's Seattle, tell me about Seattle. Nobody does that. And there's just a way of interacting in these types of conversations that get people going. The former journalist turned novelist Tom Wolfe calls that information compulsion. There are even people who actually don't want to say things and wind up just blabbering the whole thing out. I think the one regret that I do have is that I didn't bother to try to get, or I didn't try harder to get in touch with them. So, because at the very least, I could have said she refused to, return phone calls or that old journalistic thing. But she would have sent me off to her PR guy who would blah blah blah. I'm guessing, but it would have been nice to have that there as well. But it's surprising how much people will just talk.
So you gather so much research. I mean, I can't even imagine how much you gathered during that time. How hard is it to then sift through and try to figure out what stays in the book and what is on the side?
Well, when any story, even if you're making it up, it's probably harder if you're making it up because you have access to all the information. You're writing fiction, I mean. But if you're writing nonfiction, you're writing a life story. Do you start, he was born, and he did this, and he did this, and just keep going? And if you pay attention to rhetorical purpose and pay attention to aspects of good storytelling, it starts to filter out what's unnecessary. Okay, how did we begin the thing on page 1? Well, you put your guy in a moment of extreme conflict and you try to create empathy with the character that nobody even knows. Well, that didn't actually happen. Where are we going to start telling the story? You don't go, in 1973, Percy was born, and then trace it all the way up to that moment. You start right there. And then that moment in itself starts raising the questions. What is this thing he's doing? Well, let me explain. Why did he go up there? Well, let me explain. And then, again, you put him up at his highest point where he finally makes it to the page ranks. And that's when you tell everybody he's been killed. Because you want everybody to feel like we did at the funeral. What? What? Huh? That allows you to explain why. Well, this happened in 2003. This happened in 1974. And now instead of just telling you stuff, we're using the information to make a point. And that's what helps to filter out what's necessary and what isn't. Because otherwise you would wind up with a 5,000-page book that forces the reader to make sense of everything. So those two, the rhetorical purpose and the storytelling. And I learned most of the storytelling from Professor Barkley over there. So, okay. Thank you again, Brian and Robert and Nancy, for having this wonderful thing. And really, this is, what is it? It's a Thursday evening, and you guys got places to go, and you came here to hear about, a real person. This is not development, that's an abstraction. This is not the drug problem, that's an abstraction. This is a human being. And it's kind of fitting that he's a human being that isn't Aki well known. He isn't somebody who's extremely well known, because there's lots of Percys out there still that